This is part 1 of the Wholecloth Patterns Fairmount Bag Sew-Along. Today I'll share some tips for assembling your PDF pattern. We'll go over the supplies you'll need for your bag, and we'll cut the fabric. Then we'll assemble all the parts and pieces you'll need for views A and B of the Fairmount bag, so we're ready to assemble the bag in part 2 of the sew-along. You'll need a copy of the Wholecloth Fairmount Bag sewing pattern to follow along. You can find a link to the pattern in the notes below the video. Now, let's get started. We'll start by printing and assembling our PDF pattern. I'm not going to go over the details of how to do that here. If you'd like detailed instructions, you can check out the Day 2 Wholecloth Project Bag Sew-Along video, and I will link to that in the notes below the video. I am just going to highlight one difference with this pattern. The strap is printed as 3 pieces. So instead of cutting off the border for each sheet and assembling the sheets, you'll cut out each piece and assemble the pieces based on these tabs in the triangle. So A to A, then B to B. Here are the printed and assembled pattern pieces, and now we can move on to the fabric. I'm going to begin with view A. So I have some cotton canvas that I'm going to use for the main fabric, and this block print cotton will be the lining, and the contrasting block print will be the pocket. In addition to the fabrics, I've got both my zippers, the hardware, the cord to make the matching piping. I've already made my own bias binding using the How to Make Bias Tape video, and I'll link to that in the notes below. I'm ready to start cutting out my pattern pieces. I'll refer to the cut chart on page 3 of the pattern instructions so I know which pieces to cut for which view. I'm making view A, and I'm going to start with the main fabric. I'm going to cut out the strap first because it uses nearly the full width of the fabric. The pattern calls for 54-inch wide fabric, and the strap is 47 inches long. The pattern indicates that it should be laid out across the grain of the fabric, so perpendicular to the main grain of your fabric. If your fabric doesn't have a clear directional print, you could lay it out either parallel or perpendicular to the grain. It really doesn't matter, just do what is most efficient for your fabric. I'm going to cut mine across the grain, and as you can see, it's kind of just smack in the middle of the piece of fabric because that's the way it fits. I did buy new fabric for this sew-along, but I feel like using new fabric isn't true to the way I sew. I usually use leftover fabric from garment sewing to make bags, and I want that to be reflected in what I'm doing here. So I'm working with a remnant that I have left over from a jacket, and I found a place where I can cut the full strap. So that's part of why I'm starting with it. I know I need the length, so I'm going to make sure I get it for the strap. Now that I've strategically cut out the long strap piece, I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of my main fabric pieces. Be sure to pick up the pattern markings and clip the notches. I am using this fabric for matching piping, so I'll cut that from a corner now that I have all the main pattern pieces cut out. I'm not going to go over that here. I'll link to the video below called How to Make Your Own Piping. Next, we'll cut the lining pieces. This is a little bit easier because the pieces are pretty compact. Be sure to transfer the notches and any pattern markings to each piece. Next, I'll cut the fusible interfacing pieces that I need. The pattern lists some of the interfacing as optional. Whether or not to reinforce your fabric is totally a judgment call. I usually make test swatches to decide whether or not I'm going to reinforce the fabric. So here I have the unreinforced 6.5 ounce cotton canvas, and here it is fused to a medium weight interfacing. Based on this, I think that I am going to reinforce the sides of the bag so they have a little more structure and rigidity, but I'm going to leave the bottom unreinforced so that it can easily expand and contract with the pleat depending how many things I have in the bag. So I'm going to go ahead and cut and fuse those main pieces now. Just a quick recap of what we've done so far. We have all the main fabric pieces cut out. I have the interfacing ready to go for those pieces. I've already fused the interfacing to the backs of my body pieces. The lining is cut out, the piping is ready to go, and the bias tape is made. Now we can move on and construct our strap. I've already fused the interfacing onto the wrong side of the strap fabric. You can see it leaves a 1/2 inch border down each long edge. The next step is to make a 1/2 inch fold toward the wrong side of the fabric the whole length of the strap. So basically we're folding the edge over the interfacing. Once we have done this the whole length of the strap, then we fold it in half, aligning these folded edges, and I'm going to press this fold into the strap and pin or clip along the open edge. And I'm going to go ahead and finish preparing the strap now. Now we're going to top stitch along this open edge of the strap. We'll sew the whole length of the strap, about a 1/16 of an inch from the fold, and using about a 3 millimeter stitch length. So just a little bit longer than your regular sewing stitch length. And then we'll repeat that step along the closed side of the strap too. I have the top stitching down either edge of the strap, and now I'm going to divide the strap in half with a line of top stitching. And you can measure to do this, but I usually just use the guidelines on either side of my presser foot and eyeball it. Even if your strap doesn't exactly line up with something, I find that they're close enough together that I can gauge where the middle is. I'm going to divide each of these sides in half again with a line of stitching down the middle of each side. Again, I'm going to use the guidelines on my sewing machine, and I don't usually worry too much about them being perfectly evenly spaced as long as they're symmetrical from side to side. So there's the top stitching on my finished strap. I'm going to set this aside until later and begin working on the ring loop. Making the ring loop is very similar to constructing the strap. I've already fused the interfacing to the middle of my fabric piece on the wrong side, and I'm left with a 1/2 inch border down both short edges. I'm going to make a 1/2 inch fold to the wrong side along each of those short edges. Now I'm going to fold the whole thing in half, aligning the edges I just folded, and I'll press the fold into this side, and I'm going to clip the open edge. Just like with the strap piece, I'm going to do a line of top stitching down the open edge, a 1/16 of an inch from the fold, and then I'm going to repeat that along the closed edge. Now that I've done the top stitching, I'm going to thread the D-ring onto the fabric, and I'll fold it in half, aligning these raw edges. And now I'm going to baste about 1/4 inch from this raw edge to hold the D-ring on the fabric. I'll set the finished ring loop aside until I'm ready to assemble the bag. Next, I'm going to construct the body. I have the body lining piece that I've transferred the markings for the zipper pocket onto. And here I have the pocket piece that also has the zipper marking on the wrong side. I've also put the zipper marking on the right side because it will help me line up the fabrics. So with right sides together, line up the rectangle, and then I'm going to pin around the opening. Now I'm going to stitch around this rectangle following these guidelines, and I'm going to be careful to pivot at the corners. Next, I'm going to cut a slit down the middle of my rectangle, and I'll stop about 1/2 inch from each short end. There, I'm going to make a Y shape to connect my middle slit with each corner, and I'll cut as close as I can to the corner without cutting through the line of stitching. Next, I'm going to push the pocket fabric through this slit. So it will basically look like this, but the wrong sides will be together instead of the right sides. I'm going to press these seams to make a nice, crisp, rectangular opening. Here's what it looks like after I've pressed the rectangular opening. I'm going to turn it over so that the right side of the lining fabric is facing up. And I'm going to take my 7-inch interior zipper and I'm going to center it in this opening. I've positioned the zipper so it's evenly spaced inside the rectangular opening from end to end and side to side, and I've pinned the zipper in place. You want to check the back to make sure you're not catching the pocket. It should still be laying flat. Now I'm going to sew the zipper in place by top stitching around the opening about 1/16 inch from the edge of the fabric. I've switched to the zipper foot so I can get as close as possible to the edge of the fabric. I'm going to pause and open the zipper so that the zipper pull doesn't interfere with my sewing. With the zipper installed, I can finish sewing the pocket. I'm going to fold the pocket in half so that the bottom edge is aligned with the top edge above the zipper. I want to pin these two fabrics together, but just these two fabrics, not the lining. So I'm going to fold the lining out of the way. I'm going to keep the top of the lining piece folded away from my pocket, and I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance across the top of my pocket. I'll use a similar technique to sew closed each side of the pocket. I'll fold each side of the lining out of the way so I can sew closed the sides of the pocket using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Here is my finished zipper pocket. I did just realize that to be completely true to my illustrated instructions, I should have put the closed zipper pull on the right side of the pocket. It's not a big deal. It is a little bit more convenient if you're right-handed for the pocket to open from the right side, but I'm not going to change this for now. I'm going to move on to attaching this to the main fabric. We're going to continue to assemble our body pieces. I'm going to turn my lining over so that the wrong side is facing up. And then I'm going to layer on top of it one of the main fabric body pieces. So I'm just going to line up all the raw edges and the notches with the wrong sides together. At this point, you could baste around the edges to hold these two pieces in place, but I'm just going to pin it loosely. I'm going to position one of my piping strips around this curved edge of the bag, and it will begin and end at these two dots. When I'm laying this out, I usually start at about the middle and work my way up on each side, and I pin or clip it with the raw edge of the piping aligned with the raw edge of the fabric. Once I have the basic outline pinned, I'll go back and position the ends at the dots. To end the piping cord, I'm going to fold it down on itself so that the fold in the actual piping cord is at the mark on my fabric, and this extra end is folded back across what will be our seam allowance. I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place, and I'm going to repeat it on the other side. Now I'm going to baste all of this together. Remember, we have the lining on the back, the main fabric at the front, and the layers of the piping. We want to baste through all of these layers. We'll start just above the fold in the piping on one side, follow around this curved edge, and we'll end just above the piping on the other side. Here's the bag body all basted together. I'm going to trim these overhanging pieces of the piping just along the edge of the fabric behind them. And then I'm going to repeat these steps with the other side. At this point, we're going to pause sewing view A and catch up on view B. If you would like to skip ahead to the next step for both bags, you can move on to the Fairmount Bag Sew-Along Part 2 video. The first thing we need to do for view B is transfer the quilt lines from the pattern piece to our fabric. There are a couple of different ways to do that. I think for such a small quilted piece, the easiest way is with tracing paper and a tracing wheel. Tracing paper is for marking fabric. It has like a chalky film on one side and it's just paper on the other side. So we're going to layer the chalky side onto the fabric that we want the marking to show up on. And we're going to put it between the fabric and the pattern piece that has the markings on it. And then I'm going to use my straight edge to trace the markings with the marking wheel. So there you can see the line that I've traced from the pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and continue tracing the markings onto my fabric piece. So there are the transferred quilting lines. Now I'm going to get my rectangles of the interior lining fabric and my cotton batting, and I'm going to put my main fabric on top of it. I'm going to put a few pins in it so it doesn't shift around too much while I'm quilting. For the quilting, I'm going to start with one of these long lines near the middle of the piece. I'm going to start at the top and sew to the bottom, and then when I move to the next line of quilting, I'm going to start at the bottom and sew to the top. And I'm going to continue in that top to bottom, bottom to top manner from the middle out. Then I'll go back to the next middle line and sew my way out until all the lines of quilting have been sewed. I find that this zigzag pattern cuts down on the amount of distortion in the pattern piece while you're quilting. I'm also going to use the walking foot on my sewing machine because that cuts down on the drag between the layers and will also limit the distortion of this top piece. I'm going to use a 3mm stitch length, the same as top stitching for the lines of quilting. I've finished the quilting for both sides of the body of the bag. Next, I'm going to trim off this excess quilting. I'm going to transfer the pattern markings and make sure both pieces have the notches marked. Next, we'll prepare the open interior pocket. I'm going to turn the fabric over to the wrong side. My fabric is the same on both sides, but I have this center line marked for the top stitching to divide the pocket on the right side. So I'm going to turn it over to the wrong side. We're going to make 2 folds along this top straight edge. The first one will be 1/4 inch and the second one will be 1/2 inch. And I'm going to go ahead and press those folds into the top of my pocket. So there are my folds to the wrong side. I'm going to top stitch about 1/16 inch from the edge of this fold to sew it down. Now I can attach my pocket to the body of the bag. I'm going to start with the body piece with the lining facing up, and I'm going to position my pocket on it so that the wrong side of my pocket is up against the lining side of the bag. I'm going to match the notches, and then I will pin and baste around this curve, and then I can top stitch along this center line to divide the pocket. We've assembled both sides of view B with the open interior pocket and both sides of view A with the zip interior pocket. We'll sew the rest of both views of the Fairmount bag in the next video called Fairmount Bag Sew Along Part 2.